Our next lesson is on using proportions to solve percent problems. So this will cover pages 22 and 23 in your 7.2 book. The first question asks you to solve the ratio and draw arrows and show what you multiply by. So when we're going from 4 to 20, we are going to multiply by 5. So we'll do the same thing to the top, which means our answer is 15. So we would end up with 3/4 equals 15 out of 20. Question number 2 says to solve the ratio as you did in question 1, but note that the arrows are going to have to go from right to left instead of left to right. So to get from 3 to 15, we need to multiply by 5. So we'll do the same to the bottom, which means 4 times 5 gives us 20. So 15 out of 20 is equal to 3/4, which we saw on the page before as well. The first question does some of the steps for you, but we're finding multiple equivalent fractions. So for each question, you'll have to reduce the fraction given before you can find the equivalent fraction. And the first one started for you. So how did we get from 8/10 to 4/5? We divided it by 2. Now we're going to move from 4/5 to something out of 15. So we need to right, so we're going to multiply 5 by 3 to get to 15. So 4 times 3 is 12. So we'll end up with our 12/15 at the end. Now for the rest of the questions, they won't fill in everything quite the same way for you. You'll have to figure out what your bottom number is going to be. So we need a number that we can divide 6 by, and then we can multiply that number to get to 15. So what number fits that bill? So we know that we can divide 6 to get 3, and then we can multiply 3 to get 15. So we started by dividing by 2. So that means our middle fraction will be 2 out of 3. And then what do we need to do to get to our last fraction? We're going to multiply by 5, and so that is going to give us 10 out of 15. So it might be tricky figuring out that middle denominator, but just think of what can I get from here to then get smaller and then get bigger. Now this will look quite similar to our last lesson. It says to write the proportion to represent the percent problem. Now here's the difference. It says to solve the proportion. So we can have a question mark in this first line, but we will not have any question marks in our fractions at the end. So what percent of 20 is 4? What would our first part be? Our first part would be 4, and our whole would be of. Often gives us a hint that the number that comes after of is usually our whole, right? Because it's the part of a whole. So in this case, our whole would be 20. And then we have to look at, do we know what percent we have? Well, it says what percent. So that would be unknown. Now, when we're filling in our fractions, instead of putting a question mark, we're just going to leave the question mark blank. So our first fraction would be 4 out of 20. And we don't know what our numerator is, but we know our second denominator, if it's a percent, will be 100. Now, how do we get from 20 to 100? We need to multiply by 5, and we'll do the same thing to the top. So that will give us 20 out of 100. So remember, for these ones, you're actually solving the fraction. Our question mark is in the first part, but not in the fractions. I am not going to be doing number 5 with you today, but I will go through an example for number 6. It asks you to write a proportion A over B equals X over 100 to represent each problem, and then solve by writing A over B in lowest terms. So The first example will ask us what percent of 15 is 3. So, to write my a over b and x over 100, what will I need to do? We don't know what our percentage is, so we're going to leave that as x out of 100. So instead of using a question mark, we'll use x. Now our a over b is just going to be our numbers of, okay, a is our part, b is our whole. So our ab fraction would be 3 out of 15. So this is the first step. The second step they ask for is to solve by first writing a out of b in lowest terms. So what can I divide 3 and 15 by? I can divide them both by. We're going to divide them both by 3. So that gives us 3 divided by 3 is 1, and 15 divided by 3 is 5. Now we still need to get this to become 100, right? So 1 out of 5 equals what out of 100? What would I need to multiply by now? I would need to multiply by 20, so I do the same thing to the top, which gives me 20 out of 100. So we would have that as 20% of 15 is 3. Okay, question 7 asks you to write a proportion to represent the percent problem, and then find an equivalent ratio to rewrite the proportion and solve the new proportion. So our question is, what is 75% of 48? So what information do we know? Part, whole, and percent. Because we have of 48, of is our clue that that's our whole. We don't know our part, and our percent is 75. So we're going to have our two fractions. So we'll start with our part over our whole equals our percent. Now, it's not easy for us to get from 48 to 100 in one step. So instead, we're going to find a different way to get there. Now, they give us a hint that says start by writing 75% as an equivalent ratio with a denominator of 4. So we're going to turn 75 out of 100 into a fraction out of 4. What would that fraction be? It would be 3 out of 4. And now to get to 48 is not as hard, right? 4 times what gives us 48? 4 times 12 gives us 48. And so 3 times 12, remember we're moving to the left, is 36. So 36 out of 48 is equal to 75%. So we have two fractions that we're working with to get here. I'll let you solve most of these other ones on your own because they're kind of word problems, but I'll go through one example for question 9 with you. It simply tells you to solve. So if it says 9 is 60% of what number, we're going to be going through our different sequences. So 9 is 60% of what number? So we have our part whole. We can't get directly from 60 to 9, right? So we have done things where we could go from 9, we need to get to 60 on the other side. A common factor could be 3, right? We could end up with a 3 instead, go from 60 down to 3, and back up to 9. You also, if you remember it and are comfortable with it, can use the fish. So with the fish, it just needs to have its tail at the unknown, and the other side of the tail will either be the opposite, up or down from it. Now with the fish, your first step is to multiply, and your second step is to divide. So we're going to go 9 times 100 because that's our first numbers that we're tracing with this fish. So that equals 900. and then we're going to divide it by 60 because that's the next number we go to, and that will bring us to our answer there. So 900 divided by 60 is 15. So we should also be able to find that, okay, well, if we divide this by 20, right, then that gives us 3 out of 5, and then we multiply by 3, and that gives us 9 out of 15. So 2 different ways to get the same answer, okay? But if you like the fish, feel free to use the fish. He will be your friend all through high school.